Okay.
I think that's the light, right?
Yeah, this work for you?
Fine. Private lesson.
Well, let's see. We got a couple people on the line. There's my son Eitan, and there's somebody on an iPhone here. Okay. Well, it is a minute after 7 already, so we'll go ahead and get started. Um, so again, thank you everyone for joining. First and foremost, thank you to Hashem for giving me the opportunity to share with you again. Uh, Times in the past, times in the future. God willing, we'll share over some good wisdom. Thank you to the rabbis here for giving me the opportunity to present on Rabbi Wine's behalf. And we'll say this learning tonight in the memory of Chen Yefredo Bat Reuven. This is Wendy Ryback's mother. I think she's actually approaching the Shloshim at this point. Okay, so we'll start off with a couple of points about the parsha. So the parsha this week, we're at the end of the book of Shmot, which my kids would call Shmois, if you need a translation. So the parsha is called Pikudei, and Pikudei refers to the accounting that is done as the Mishkan is being completed. So all the collections that were done up until this point, they were all used for the various functions throughout the Mishkan to construct various things from gold, from silver, from copper, different rings, different decorations, all kinds of different things. And it's unique in the aspect that that Moshe is instructed to give a very clear accounting of every single tiny thing that went into the building, and it's very precise. Everything it's gone through, it's about half the parsha that's just spent going through all the different intricacies of what was used. And it said that even though Moshe Rabbeinu was considered a very righteous man, it was still important for him to give over this accounting. So there was not even any impression whatsoever that he might have personally profited in any way, shape, or form from the building of the Mishkan. So this is something that we learn over for ourselves, that we should be particularly careful whenever we're dealing with basically somebody else's money, or whenever we have responsibility for something on behalf of others. So just as an example, if somebody is responsible for managing the tzedakah fund for a shul, even though he may have his own money, his own wealth, maybe he even, as he becomes the manager of the tzedakah fund, he becomes wealthy himself. Could happen at the same time even, that he should not be walking around wearing fancy clothes and these days driving a fancy car, living in a fancy house, just even to prevent the impression that he might somehow have been subject to any undue influence of this money that he was supposed to manage. There's another example. It's given over in the Gemara. The Gemara in Tractate Yoma speaks about the Avtinas family. The Avtinas family was the one that was responsible for the preparation of the Ketoret in the Beit HaMikdash, and they had special training. And there were others who were able to formulate the Ketoret. In fact, it says that some sages were brought in from Alexandria, and they were able to formulate the same exact Ketoret so that it smelled exactly the same. However, only the Avtinas family was able to formulate it in such a way that the smoke would rise straight in a single column from where it would burn. So it's a very unique skill, and they're actually criticized at one point in the Mishnah for not being willing to teach over this this kind of secret way that they formulated in order for the smoke to rise in a single column, and yet they are still looked upon favorably because, among other things, they were careful to ensure that their women were not perfumed in such a way that there was any impression, again, that they used any portion of the Ketoret or any of the spices for their own profit. Just that little thing actually, it seems, may have overcome the kind of unfavorable judgment that was upon them due to their choice not to teach over the way that the Keturah was formulated. We have other examples where it's actually I think brought down in a type of halacha. It's not really practiced today exactly, but for example, you shouldn't wear any type of clothing with pockets when you enter into a vault with somebody else's money. So if you're a money manager, you should not be walking into a private area of somebody else's money with clothing that has pockets on it or any other way to sneakily take out any type of money, just to safeguard these ideas. It's just safeguarding. It's not the actual act itself. It's the safeguarding from even looking like it. There was another one of the Tanaim. His name was Shaya Ish Turiya. He was a great sage, of course, in that period of time as a Tana. But his day job was as a launderer. And in order to ensure that there was never any impropriety when it came to the clothes, because he brought in everybody else's clothes, and it's not like clothes are so readily identifiable, he would wear the same basic white clothes every single day, just to make sure that there was never even the risk anyone would suspect him of having stolen anything else. So this is a very, very important lesson for us. Not only are we obviously commanded not to steal, but we're actually responsible for making sure that we never even give the impression to anybody else that there's a risk that it could look like that we are dealing with other things in a way that's unscrupulous at all. Okay, so that's our little Parsha summary for Pekudei, and we'll look forward to finishing up Shemot on Shabbos. Before we get into the topic for tonight, I wanted to very briefly go back to what we talked about a few weeks ago. We talked about the idea of free will. And just as a very, very brief summary, what we were talking about with free will was the idea that somebody's position that they find themselves in life is not of their free will. However, the choices that they have at a given moment are of their free will. So how does this play out in reality? Well, I happened to be listening to a radio show about a week ago, and I didn't catch the entire story, but I think the idea was this. There was a woman who had built up quite a gambling debt with Caesars, and Caesars was suing her over that debt. She countersued them, saying that they illegally lured her in. They lured her in, and therefore she built up her debt to a much, much higher level than she could have ever afforded. Well, how did they lure her in? Well, at some point they became aware that she was part of some type of gambling addicts program, and yet they would call her up and say, "Hey, why don't you come back? We'll front you some money. We'll help you win back your, what you've lost," something like this. Again, I don't know the exact details. I didn't hear the entire thing, but that was the idea of her countersuit. So how does this play out in reality? So in this radio program, they're speaking to amongst other people, a behavioral scientist. And they ask him, okay, if you were on the jury, how would you find? He says, well, it all comes down to, do you have free will? Don't you have free will? Is it predestined? Whatever. Okay, again, you as a behavioral scientist, if you were on the jury, how would you find? He says, well, it's pretty clear. We believe that people have the free will to choose. It may be very, very difficult for them to choose. And it may be completely immoral what Caesars chose to do. And under certain circumstances, maybe if a legislative body had created an appropriate law, it may even end up being illegal someday. But it doesn't make her argument valid. It doesn't make the fact that they called her up and tried to lure her back in, and that somehow they are guilty of the debts that she accumulated. It does not make that argument valid. That was what he said, and that's actually ultimately what the appeals court, who had ruled at that point, that's what they said as well. They said it was disgusting and immoral on behalf of Caesars. Nonetheless, she was responsible for the debt that she had built up. And there you go. I think it's a very good example of how it plays out in reality. Does it always play out that way? Do you not find jurors that are sympathetic somehow and that maybe would find that, she suffered and she didn't have free will? Could be. But in this case, the judges, behavioral scientists, others felt that it was clear that, yeah, she acted of her own free will, no matter how challenging that may have been, and no matter what circumstance she may have been placed in by Hashem. She was placed in that circumstance by Hashem. Nonetheless, at that moment, it was her free will choice to continue to gamble and to build up further debt. Okay. So this is probably going to be the last class that we have, at least for a while. Rabbi Weim, thankfully, will be back, I believe, next Sunday. Yes, Stuart.
I'm going to buy him a ski trip that he can't turn down.
Yeah,
So-
anybody's welcome to do that. You're welcome to send Rabbi away anytime.
So you best start prepared.
I'm sure he'll appreciate it as much as anybody else. So I had to kind of pick through what to speak about in terms of insights from Rabbi Tatz, because he has a lot of other chapters in this book that we've been learning from, the Thinking Teenagers, the Think Jewish Teenagers Guide, right? So I decided that we're going to speak on a chapter that he calls Silence. You might also title this chapter The Power of Words, but he calls it Silence. So it's not lost on me that it's kind of ironic that we're going to be speaking over tonight on a chapter that's called Silence, and we're going to talk about it, and hopefully we'll delve into it kind of deeply through speaking about it. But you'll see very quickly how it's ironic that we're going to have to speak this over. Basically, what he's saying is the way that you develop true depth is through silence. Choosing to quiet yourself, and this can be true whether or not you're trying to learn over a topic for yourself, whether or not you are trying to be a more active listener, whatever the case is, developing an inner silence is really a primary way through which to develop true depth of understanding and meaning. So what are some of the examples of this? So he gives over the idea that words are inherently limited. That's what they are. And that the deepest experiences that we go through in life are always the most difficult to express into words. And if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense, right? That's kind of how it should be. In order to take something that we have been through ourselves, especially if it created some type of emotional response. But even if it's just something that we saw, something that was visual, something that we heard, that we learned over, the way that we internalize that, the way that we hear that information, the way that we see that, the way that we emotionally connect to it, to put it in words is inherently limiting and therefore has natural flaws to it. There's an element of truth that is removed whenever you put something into words. So, you think about circumstances that you've been in where you were, again, overwhelmed. Maybe you were excited by something and you really had this almost need to share it over. And it can be very, very painful to realize that the person you're speaking to is just not getting where you're coming from. And normally the deeper the experience, the more emotional it is, the more personal it is, the harder it is to put it into words. And so I think overall we can all really kind of connect to and understand this idea, the idea that words are inherently limiting. So what's the kind of antidote for this? The antidote is to develop such close relationships with people that you don't need so many words in order to share it over, where you can give a few words over, and because the person knows you and feels you and understands you, they get what you've gone through and they get your experience without the need for so many words. And that's when things really become the deepest, when you have this understanding and relationship with another where words just become unnecessary. That inherently flawed truth kind of is not even part of the equation. And a lot of times you'll find when you need to just keep on like adding words and adding words and adding words, it actually is a demonstration of a lack of communication. Somebody's not communicating well with the other person. When you just have to keep on talking and talking and talking, that's really ultimately what it means. It means that there's a risk that you guys are just you're not connecting, you're not figuring each other out very well. It's also very, very important to remember whenever you are trying to express yourself in words, that words are not the thing that you're trying to express. They are just an expression of whatever that thing was. And it's good to remember that when you're putting things in words, you're only doing that for other people. The fact that you even have a name, your name is not really for you. Maybe it carries something personal for you. Maybe it carries a connection to an ancestor or something like that. But your a name is not necessary for you to understand who you are. If you think of yourself as your name, you are inherently limiting yourself, no matter what that is. If you know yourself and who you are deeply, you don't need a name. Your name is only necessary for other people to connect to you. And that's true basically of any types of words. So again, when you're trying to give over something, the words that you're sharing are only for another person's benefit, to share some piece of knowledge that you have in your head, to share some experience that you've gone through that you think that somebody else could connect to. So again, the more words that you have to use to express that, to express the same concept in order for them to understand it, the more, again, potentially flawed and the more falsehood you potentially introduce into the situation. I think something that I had read about this, and I don't have a specific source for this, but something I had read at one point was that even within the body of the Torah, even within the body of the Torah, so if you think about the way that the Torah is physically structured, it's parchment, right? It's this empty, blank parchment. That's how it starts. And then a sofer comes and very precisely, and we'll talk about the significance of this a little bit later, but very precisely adds in different shapes that we understand to be letters. But what are they doing? Again, even in the sense of the Torah, what they're doing is they are restricting the space of this, what had infinite potential. The parchment had infinite potential until you started putting shapes on it, until you started putting the ink on it, right? So you could have put anything on there. You could have put a poem, you could have put a story. It could be so elevated that you're putting the Torah on it. But even at the level of the Torah, the parchment becomes limited by what was placed on it. Now, thankfully, again, it's of divine origin. So we'll talk about that in a minute. That it is of a very, very highly elevated level, but to a certain extent, the spaces that still exist between the letters, the words, between paragraphs, and then between columns is what allows us to reveal the wisdom created by these letters. So it's not the letters, it's the space between the letters that is still connecting to the infinite portion that was available through this blank parchment that really is what gives us the wisdom of the Torah. I know it sounds crazy, but at the end of the day, that's really what it is. The words are still, even in the sense of Torah, are potentially restricting and potentially risk misunderstanding, where if you're able to just simply understand it, you don't need the words at all. You have this infinite connection that you can be a part of. So that brings us to the next point, which is where we all would like to be able to get to a place where we can connect to understanding and wisdom without any words whatsoever. And if you think about it, the mind is capable of that. The mind can process things without any words whatsoever. And again, I know we've all experienced this. However, I think it's become very natural, especially in this day and age, where we are just bombarded with all kinds of media from every direction, right? I imagine it used to be you didn't have to walk up into the mountains or out into the desert in order to experience a level of silence. Just walking to the market was probably mostly silent unless you were walking on a busy street. You couldn't plug your earbuds into your ears and listen to something. You couldn't bring something with you. You didn't have a TV on in the background all day, or Alexa or music or radio. You didn't have any of these things. There was an inherent silence, and therefore your mind, I believe, was probably able to more readily process things in a less limited manner. But nowadays, I imagine, if you think about it, most of the time when you're processing your thoughts, you're probably processing them using words. You're thinking about them in the sense of what you experienced, and you're doing it by having an internal conversation. I mean, when I read this, it really jumped out at me. I was kind of thinking, yeah, I don't really think I think much beyond the scope of the conversation that I have with myself all the time. And Rabbi Tatz is making it very clear we are capable of connecting to that. That is our infinite potential. We have the ability to have an internal dialogue without words. And that is where the deepest wisdom comes from. That's where the deepest understanding comes from. That's where we avoid being caught by the limited nature of describing that what we've experienced, even to ourselves. Yeah.
Without words, how do we get any input?
Right. So that comes back to the idea that we talked about before, right? Which is that words are important when you are interrelating with another person, right? Hopefully words are less important than they need to be. So like if you want input from somebody else, they're going to have to somehow express themselves to you. And probably at least a portion of that expression is going to have to be through words. But a portion of that expression, again, especially if they are particularly connected to you, hopefully won't be through words. You know, imagine last time somebody came up to you and said, "Hey, Stuart, you know when you're like, yeah, I know. I messed up," or, "Oh yeah, I remember that was really special." You know, it can go either way. And you just know, hey, you know, just by that little kind of nudge, you know what they're thinking, you know what they're feeling. Maybe they're pointing to another speaker, and like, because you know the same thing that reminded you went off in both of your heads at the same time. You didn't need any words to communicate that, and that thought goes very, very deeply. So to get a certain level of input, yes, you do need words, but to get your own input, to give yourself input about what you're experiencing, Rabbi Tatz is saying you don't need to use words. You can find a place in your mind where you don't need words, because those words are inherently limiting what you can benefit from or what you can get out of the experience that you're going through or experiences you've gone through. Again, it speaks to me because I don't remember the last time that I processed something in my head without using words. I don't remember that. Maybe dreams, maybe something like that. And I'm curious for myself if I can get a little bit further along into what he's saying, if I can start to be in a place where I don't need to use words with my own internal dialogue.
That sounds like supernatural.
All I can tell you is what he's saying, and it makes sense.
It's very abstract.
It's abstract, and yet I think a lot of people would agree that it does make sense that the mind shouldn't need words to have an internal dialogue. It shouldn't. It shouldn't need that. Okay, so then he gets into something really interesting. So, you know, when we do start to form words, of course, he's going to go to the same source that all of us are going to go to, the Hebrew letters, the Hebrew words. I mean, that's, you know, that's where you would expect a rabbi, an Orthodox Jew to go to. So he starts by mentioning, look at the structure of the Aleph Bet. What's the very first letter? The letter that represents oneness, that represents unity, that represents a very, very deep level of understanding. It's an Aleph. And what is the Aleph? It's silent. It's silent. It makes no sound of its own. And therefore, he's saying from that, we can interpret the idea that true oneness, true depth of knowledge and understanding sources from that Aleph. It sources from a level of silence, a level of silence. We'll start with that. Maybe not complete silence, but a level of silence. But knowing that that's where the structure of our entire Hebrew language comes from. The whole thing starts with a silent letter. You know, again, it's kind of eye-opening to think of it that way. So then he continues on. The next three letters of the Hebrew alphabet are Bet Gimel Daled, which if you put those three letters to word, it spells out those three letters together. It spells out the word Beged, which refers to clothing. So he's saying you can look at clothing in a couple of different ways. On the one hand, clothing is something that can enwrap and can protect. But the word, the same shoresh that makes up the word, the same root that makes up the word beged, also makes up the word that we would translate as treachery, deceitfulness, right? And in that regard, what can happen is you can end up in clothing the true source of truth, the source of truth in something that can potentially deceive. So if we think again about ourselves, our true inner core is something that's, buried deep within us, that we know what it is, we know what level of truth it represents, but we can choose through our spiritual clothing, not even our physical clothing yet, but our spiritual clothing, we can choose to reveal that, or we can choose to hide that. If I want to sound like I'm some brilliant scientist or philosopher or religious scholar, I can do that in any number of different ways through the way that I choose to express myself, even though I know deep inside myself that I'm somebody different. And we can do it through our physical clothes too. We can, put on the fancy watch and the, nice looking clothes and always wear something new. And it may hide the fact that we're actually, buried in credit card debt. Or we can do the opposite. We can walk around looking like we're poor and destitute and beg for money when actually we know we're very financially secure. And we can do anything in between. We can choose to expose who we truly are and express who we truly are in our soul through our clothing as well. So that's what he's saying. So we move from the idea of silence into the idea of what do we do with that silence? Do we enclose that silence, that core, that source of truth? Do we enclose it in something that enhances it and allows it to be revealed in its truthful ways we can in this physical world? Or do we choose to put on clothing of treachery, of deceitfulness, and enclose it in something that just seems to expose lies instead of truth? After that, he goes into something very interesting. He says that, we learn, obviously, at the beginning of the book of Shemot, about Moshe Rabbeinu, and that supposedly he had this speech impediment, right? He couldn't speak. So he says, from a spiritual sense, the idea that Moshe couldn't speak, it was sourced in the idea that Moshe connected to truth all day, every day, from when he was a youth. And when you are connected to truth and you can only express truth, you have a very significant challenge to use words to do so. I mean, again, how are you going to pick words carefully and accurately such that everybody hears only truth from you all the time? It's virtually impossible. And so Moshe was kind of spiritually forced into this level of having a speech impediment. He couldn't speak over anything that wasn't at its core completely true. And so it was almost like he couldn't speak, or he really, really struggled to speak. When did that change? At the revelation of the Torah at Har Sinai. Because at Har Sinai, among other miracles that we had a revelation of truth into finite words. The Torah uses words at the end of the day. And despite the fact that, again, we're able to see an incredible wealth of wisdom in these words, in these very finite words, because of the way that they are arranged, because of numerical values that they have, because of the grammar that they use, because of the structure, physical structure within the Torah. All these things that are revealed to us at great, great depth, at the end of the day, they are still finite, but they are of such a divine and high level that it was able to bring Moshe to the ability where he could express things in the truest form possible in this physical world. And so therefore, for the most part, his speech impediment left him once he started speaking over Torah.
Rabbi, Rabbi, teacher habit. Is there a source for that interpretation of the speech impediment and that he was only able to speak?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. I did try to look for it, but then I kind of lost track of things. But I'll go back to it. I'll go back to it. If I find it, I'll let you know.
No, I'm just curious because maybe I've heard that before, but I can't.
I agree with you. I hadn't seen that either.
Right. So, but then it's almost as though when he burned his tongue, okay, if that was that caused him to have a speech impediment.
Right. Physically, that's what caused me up. Right.
Right. Now, looking at that, is there possibly, based on what you've just read, it had to be more than just a physical impairment. There had to be a reason for it.
Right. And I think that without going into this exact story, because I don't have the source, I certainly don't have it in front of me, that everything that we see in the physical world, we have to see as originating from someplace spiritual. In that particular case, that story is I believe is a medrash. It might be in the Gemara. I don't remember exactly where it is, but we understand that it's the angel that comes down and actually guides Moshe away from the gold or the crown and to the hot coal to put in his mouth, because otherwise, from our understanding, that would have been the end of what we know as Moshe Rabbeinu. So certainly there is always a spiritual element to everything we learn. I hadn't heard this particular spiritual teaching before, so I found it very interesting. I mean I can certainly connect to the idea. So, all right. So the next thing that Rabbi Tetz shares is about the idea of secrets. So we normally learn the idea of and when we say secrets, we mean the level of sod, the level of secret within the teachings of the wisdom of Judaism. So the common structure of any teaching is that it ranges from the simple, the pshat, to the sod, to the secret, and a little bit in between. So there's more esoteric type of connections. There's the agadata, there's the stories that have both a simple level and a deeper level, and then we get to the sod, the secrets. And the traditional view of the secret is these are secret teachings. They're not permitted to be shared except for with somebody of great scholarly wisdom who has mastered everything else up to that point. So what's that?
Kabbalah?
Well, it could be. It could be Kabbalah, right? It's something like the Kabbalah would be something like that. And in fact, he goes on to say that if we share things over, that if we try to put into words the deepest levels of these types of secrets, that's the kind of thing that can actually kind of break the secret or break us, like they say, somebody studies Kabbalah when they're not really ready for it can be driven a little bit crazy. And part of the idea of that is when you try to force a meaning onto somebody that they're not yet ready to hear, that can make them a little bit cuckoo in the head. But he says the true meaning of secret is it's secret because it's something you can't share even if you try. It's so deep and infinite, or as close to infinite as that we might understand it. Even if I try to share over to the secret, you're not going to get it until you get it. My words are not going to be what reveals a secret for you. And this is a very deep understanding, that we have. Let's say, for example, when we speak of Kabbalah, we speak of something like the Zohar. So I've read in different places, why was it that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was the one who merited the right to reveal the wisdom of Kabbalah and the Zohar? He wasn't even necessarily the greatest student of Rabbi Akiva. So what's said about Rabbi Shimon is he had a way of enclothing secret meanings in such a level that they could be understood at whatever level you are at that point when you hear it, no more and no less. So if you are at a simple level in your own learning and understanding, you'll understand it in a meaningful, simple way. if you have advanced your learning to such a level that you can understand the deepest secrets, you will get that teaching from it, even though the words that you read or learned are exactly the same words as the ones of the simpleton. And this is also known amongst the teachings, let's say, for example, the stories that are told over of Rav Nachman. So, Rav Nachman's teachings are told over almost exclusively in the way of stories told by his students and his students over many, many decades. So those stories have a simple level to them, and those stories have a depth to them. And if you are not in a position to understand the depth of the story, you won't understand the depth of the story. Nonetheless, the story is meaningful enough that it'll probably stick with you. And at some point in the future, when you've reached a deeper level, you will also bring with you a deeper level of that story. And you may or may not be able to share that over with somebody else very well because it is of a potentially secret level. So the secret is not the idea that the teaching itself is a secret. The teaching is open and available for people to learn, but it's really only available for people to learn who are at such a depth that the secret reveals itself. So it's not that it's a secret that cannot be shared, but it's impossible to share in words without the other person having some type of understanding that is beyond the level of the words themselves.
Is the purpose of the secret meant to be transmitted to people?
It is, but only when they're ready to hear it, right? So only when somebody is ready to hear the secret level, when they've advanced in their own learning and whatever the area is, because you think about all the different stories you've heard over the years, you can probably think of examples yourself, or you can even think about your own experiences over time. There were secrets that Hashem meant to reveal to you through your own life experiences. And it probably, for some things, you got it and the whole thing was exposed and available to you to learn. It was the lesson that you were supposed to learn from it was available to you kind of all at the time that it happened. And other things, it's only after years of looking back and seeing all the other things that you've gone through up until that time that the true meaning or the true secret of what Hashem put you through could be understood. So for sure it was meant to be understood and learned over, but almost impossible to put into words. You just have to go through it. You can only learn it when you can learn it. Okay, continuing on a somewhat similar idea, we are taught that babies, fetuses, are instructed on all the wisdom of the Torah, all the wisdom of the world when they are before they're born, right? So they go through all this learning, including the deepest secrets of the universe, before they are born. And as they're being born, they are struck on the mouth, and that's how we get this little indent that we have on the top of our lip here. And Rabbi Tatz questions us, says, how does it make sense that you learned all this wisdom and you're struck on the mouth? Why wouldn't you have like a dent to the head? Just logically speaking, we should all have like a little bit of a, I don't know, like it looks like the curve of a bat or something like that in our head. That's what should have knocked the sense out of us. But what he's saying is actually the blow to the mouth is Hashem's gift to the baby of speech. That's what it is. It's the gift of speech. Kind of like what we have with Moshe Rabbeinu. Without removing that level of wisdom, there'd be no way for such a high functioning being like a human to be able to speak. And what happens is it allows for this high wisdom to be shrunk into something that has a finite or definite or a finite form. And that's where the baby has to grow from. So the baby's job over the course of a lifetime is to reconnect this finite structure that the baby has put together, child, adult has put together through words, through thought, through expression, and to be able to reconnect it back to original thought, to original ideas that are beyond words, and to get back to the infinite. And how do you get to that? Through silence. Through silence, through understanding and getting back to the point where we can remove the finite structure of the words from all that wisdom and all that learning that we go through over the course of a lifetime. So he also talks about this idea that as we grow older and older and learn how to express ourselves with words, that we go through various experiences that are almost impossible to express through words. And one of those might be something like dealing with pain. And we know, for example, that the previous generations that went through the Holocaust, many of them chose to more or less never speak over what they went through. And again, for many people, the common understanding might be that what they went through was so treacherous and so painful that it would just open up too many wounds in order, for them to try and express it again. But a deeper understanding might be that it's just not possible to actually put into words. Any attempt to take that level of trauma, that whatever was seen, whatever was felt, anything that you would do to put into words, at a minimum, would cheapen it. At a minimum, would bring something that is indescribable to try to describe it would really kind of be a travesty in a certain way. At a minimum, that's what we've done. And in a worst case, we would completely misrepresent it. To say that this individual at this concentration camp who tortured people was a horrible person, it's almost horrible to say he's a horrible person. That by itself is almost a travesty. How could you ever put in words how bad such a person is? And so choose not to express it at all. It's one way to choose to go through this. Another completely opposite way, in the really the main service of something like therapy, psychotherapy, would be through actually speaking things out, right? So on the one hand, somebody's dealt with such an infinitely high level of pain, or maybe, God willing, on the other hand, an infinitely high level of pleasure, they cannot speak it over in words, so they never try to. On the other hand, people go through such dramatic or traumatic experiences, and one way to lessen the pain is to put words to it. That's it. That's what therapy is for. Therapy can bring something that's only silent, that's only expressed in thought in your own head, that is infinite in its source, and therefore the pain experienced from it could be infinite, and to put it into words. And even though those words may be flawed, they put a finite structure on it. They box it in. They make it something that can be tolerated, dealt with, managed, and that's the idea of going through therapy. It's not to say one is right or one is wrong. It's further understanding and explanation of why silence is so incredibly powerful, sometimes overwhelmingly powerful, and why words are so limiting and sometimes necessarily limiting. Sometimes we need those words in order to tolerate the experience that we're going through. And using both of those kind of concepts together can help us get to our own level of understanding where we are best suited to learn Torah from. Whether we should be learning Torah by speaking it over constantly to others, because our nature is one of I need to kind of make this boxed in and finite. I need to put a clear definition on it, and then I can use that once I've grasped it and understood it, and elevate it to the place where it kind of works around in my head in a way that I internalize it and becomes more emotional, more deeply connected. I think, as Rabbi Wein always says, the longest distance is from your head to your heart, right? So you can be allowed to do that sometimes when you're able to put it in your head through a finite sense of words. And other people, it's kind of the opposite. They almost need to experience it. And that's the level on which they can learn Torah. But in either case, there has to be some space that's given for silence. There has to be that space, or you won't ever fully internalize all the wisdom that's available through the Torah. Um, Going back to the entire approach of this book, when we talked to the beginning of the first class when we were talking about this book, his whole point is to teach us over to a teenager, and teenagers, are developing the personalities, their personalities in life. And as I was sharing again in the first class, I thought that that's relevant just as much so for about tshuva or somebody who's got less experience so far in their life being Jewish. They're still developing their Jewish personality. And to a certain extent, maybe we all go through that, but maybe a little bit more so those who aren't raised in such a religious environment. So we want to understand how to use silence to further develop our own personality. And that's kind of where he begins to conclude this chapter. So he says, there always needs to be a depth and a level to each one of us that's left unrevealed. That's very, very important. You need to always withhold a certain portion of who you are through your own silence. So that's the place where you can internalize your experience, where you can understand what you're seeing at a deeper level. And it doesn't mean you're hiding anything. That's not the point, but just that there are levels and depths to. And I think this is a very kind of classic thing for Jews. Jews tend to be thinkers. Even though they may be very expressive and maybe very good speakers and very dynamic and very outgoing, they tend to be thinkers. They tend to internalize things. You can see that with Jews, how they're always processing, they're always looking deeper and deeper. And it's important for us to understand that our lives are not the script of what happens to us. That's very superficial. You know, I can't write a movie version of what's happened in my life, even if I get every word written down, every person I interacted with, every scene I was ever in, every description of everything that's going on in this room, the colors, the posters, the carpeting, no matter what I've ever done, I can't write that in a script and somehow think that that's my life. That's extremely, extremely superficial. And we need to understand that we are created in a much, much more unlimited manner. And that is the essence of Judaism. That is the essence of who our Jewish character is. And he expresses this further through the story of King David. So there's a story of King David. He goes out and dances with, I think it's with a Sefer Torah. There's a whole dedication ceremony that's going on. And he's criticized by his wife, Michal, when he comes back. And she's telling him how, he looked like a fool out there, how he was dancing among his people, and that he emptied himself out. That's basically the phrasing that she used, and she's deeply criticized for this by the commentary. And actually, it said that she did not bear children until the day she died. Basically, she died in childbirth as a result of the criticism of King David. So, what was she truly criticizing? She was criticizing King David for exposing the depth of everything that he was, the depth of his soul. And it said that dancing actually does this. Dancing is an expression, something closer to an unlimited expression of who we are than words would be. Words, again, as we've talked about, are inherently limiting. Dancing is an expression of self that can go a little bit deeper than words can, and it can actually, again, quote unquote, expose a portion of your soul. And we don't need to go into this, but there's aspects of this that are used to explain why, let's say, for example, mixed dancing is generally something that's discouraged, because it can reveal portions of you that are meant to be held back a little bit and hidden. But King David says to Michal, really, you thought that I put everything that I was out there? And the true criticism of Michal is thinking that everything she saw of King David, no matter how much it was that he exposed, that's all there was to him. And that she didn't really know who he was, because she didn't realize that he had still a tremendous amount of depth to him that he had left unrevealed. And that was the criticism that somebody thought that she knew so well who he was that she thought he had exposed everything, when in fact he had held back a tremendous amount of who his true infinite potential was. So again, we're getting close to the end of the chapter. He comes back to the idea of making sure to can always be in a place where you're connecting to your quiet self, where you take the time to not just know what you want to say, but know the depths of what you want to express before you open your mouth. And in fact, even better, if you don't need to speak, don't. Don't speak unnecessarily. And if you know it's not going to be possible to express what you want to express, this would be another reason to restrict what you say or how you say it or to speak at all. And to make sure that you're always keeping space in your mind for that silence. So even when you are speaking over or when you're listening to somebody else, always, be conscious that you've got a place in your mind where you can process kind of behind the scenes and understand what's going on back there. And to remember always to truly hear, to truly learn, to truly connect to the highest levels of understanding and truth and our infinite potential, we need to be silent. And only after we fully internalize something can we put ourselves in a position where we can share over a portion of that to others in whatever limited or unlimited way that we've got the capability to do. And with that, I believe we will conclude our class unless there's anything that either Stuart or anybody who's on the Zoom call would like to share or ask. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining tonight. Hope everybody has a great evening, and God willing, we'll have a chance to learn together again soon. Eitan, is this Eitan raising his hand or clapping? I think that's the clapping emoji. Thank you. All right.
He's got a bias.
And there's the thumbs up. All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Can't say I understood it all, but it was a